The first gunshot split the morning air like thunder, and Violet Gallagher knew her time in Wilson, Colorado had come to an abrupt end. It wasn't the law she feared, it was the men who operated outside of it, the same men who'd murdered her father for a gold claim that was rightfully his. Now they were coming for her, and the only direction left to run was west, toward the mountains and the raging Gunnison River beyond. Spring of 1876 had brought an early thaw to the Rockies, and the rivers were swollen with snowmelt. Violet's chestnut mare pounded across the valley floor, her rider's long auburn hair streaming behind her like a battle flag. At 22, Violet had grown up in mining camps and frontier towns, her father teaching her to ride, shoot, and survive in a land that showed little mercy to the weak. But now, with him buried on a lonely hillside outside town, she was truly alone. "They're still coming," she hissed to herself, risking a glance over her shoulder. 3 riders, maybe 4, their forms wavering in the distance like dark specters against the golden Colorado landscape. She'd grabbed what she could, her father's gold pouch with their meager savings, his journal with the map to their claim, and the Colt revolver he'd given her for her 20th birthday. Everything else was left behind in their small cabin on the edge of town. The sound of pursuit grew louder as she approached the tree line. The forest would provide some cover, but her mare was tiring, lathered with sweat and breathing hard. They'd been riding for nearly an hour at breakneck speed. "Come on, Penny," she urged, leaning forward in the saddle. Just a little farther. The trees swallowed them, dappled sunlight filtering through the pines. Violet steered Penny through the undergrowth, following a game trail that led deeper into the wilderness. The hoofbeats behind her faded slightly, but she knew better than to slow down. Jebediah Blackwell's men were persistent. They wouldn't give up until they had the map to her father's claim, even if it meant killing her like they'd killed him. The forest began to thin, and the roar of water filled her ears. The Gunnison River lay ahead, swollen with the spring melt, a churning cauldron of white water that sliced through the mountain landscape like a knife wound. Violet reined in her exhausted mare at the riverbank, dismounting quickly to survey her options. There was no bridge here, no safe crossing. The river was at least 50 feet across, the current visibly strong. To her right, the water disappeared around a bend. To her left, she could see rapids ahead, the river narrowing between jagged rocks. Neither direction offered an easy escape. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. She had minutes, maybe less. "Come on, girl," she whispered to Penny, leading her downstream toward a stand of trees where they might hide. But as they reached the cover, a shot rang out, splintering bark from a pine just inches from Violet's head. "There she is," a voice called. Violet dropped to the ground, pulling Penny down with her behind the trees. She drew her revolver, checking to make sure it was fully loaded. "Gallagher, girl," one of the men shouted. "We just want to talk, the way you talked to my father." She called back, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "That was unfortunate business," another voice answered. "But you still have something that belongs to Mr. Blackwell." "Nothing belongs to him," Violet shouted. "That claim was my father's. He found it, he worked it." "Well, now it's Blackwell's," the first man replied. "And you've got the map we need. Hand it over and maybe you walk away." The maybe told Violet all she needed to know. These men had no intention of letting her live. She crouched lower, peering through the underbrush. 3 riders had dismounted about 50 yards away, using their horses for cover as they advanced slowly. She didn't have enough bullets to take them all, and even if she did, she wasn't certain she could outdraw 3 experienced gunmen. The river remained her only option, as dangerous as it was. Penny nickered softly, sensing her rider's tension. Violet stroked the mare's muzzle, making a decision that tore at her heart. "You've been a good girl," she whispered, "but I can't take you with me." She removed her saddlebags and secured them across her body, checking that the precious journal was safely inside the oilskin pouch. Then she slipped off her boots, knowing they would only drag her down in the water, and stuffed them into the saddlebags as well. Finally, she slapped Penny hard on the flank. "Go on," she hissed. "Go!" The startled horse bolted away from the river, drawing immediate gunfire from Blackwell's men. Violet used the distraction to break cover, sprinting toward the water's edge. She heard shouts behind her, then more gunshots. A bullet kicked up dirt at her heels. Another whizzed past her ear, but she didn't stop. The shock of the icy water nearly took her breath away as she plunged into the river. The current caught her immediately, sweeping her away from the bank with frightening speed. She managed one deep breath before the rapids took her, tumbling her beneath the surface. The water was a chaotic fury, slamming her against rocks, spinning her until she couldn't tell up from down. Her lungs burned for air. Just as spots began to dance before her eyes, the current thrust her upward and she gasped, filling her lungs before being dragged under again. On the bank, the three men watched in disbelief as the woman disappeared into the churning rapids. "Damn it!" cursed the leader, a weather-beaten man with a scar across his cheek. "Blackwell's going to have our hides for this. She's caught in the rapids," one of the others said, shaking his head. "Ain't no way she's surviving that. The Gunnisons claimed better swimmers than her." "We need to be sure," the leader insisted. "Blackwell wants that map. Thompson, ride downstream and see if she washes up. Jenkins, go after the horse. She might have stashed the map in her saddlebags. I'll follow the river from this side." As they mounted up, none of them noticed the lone rider who had been watching the scene unfold from the ridge above. He sat motionless on his buckskin gelding, a Winchester rifle resting across his saddle. When the three men separated, he nudged his horse forward, following the path of the river at a distance. Downstream, Violet fought for her life. The river had become her enemy and her salvation, carrying her away from Blackwell's men but threatening to claim her with each passing moment. She managed to keep her head above water between the worst of the rapids, gasping for air whenever she could. A large rock loomed ahead. She struck it hard with her shoulder, crying out in pain, but managed to cling to its surface, the current trying to tear her away. For a moment, she hung there, trembling with cold and exertion, assessing her situation. The riverbank was close, perhaps 15 feet away, but the current between her and safety was swift. She looked upstream and saw one of the riders following along the bank. He hadn't spotted her yet, but it was only a matter of time. With a silent prayer, she pushed off from the rock, aiming for the shore with all her remaining strength. The current fought her, but Violet was fighting for her life. Stroke by desperate stroke, she inched closer to the bank. Her feet found purchase on the riverbed, then slipped. She lunged forward, catching hold of a tree root that protruded from the eroded soil. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself out of the water and into the shelter of the overhanging bank, concealed by brush and roots. Collapsing in the mud, she lay still, trying to quiet her ragged breathing as hoofbeats approached. Through the tangle of roots, she could see the rider passing by, his eyes scanning the river. He continued downstream, and Violet allowed herself a moment of relief. The respite was short-lived. Her body was beginning to shake uncontrollably from the cold. She needed to find shelter, dry clothes, and warmth, or the river would claim her after all. She checked her saddlebags miraculously. The oilskin pouch had protected the journal. The gold was still there too, though her revolver was lost to the current. Violet forced herself to move, crawling away from the river through the underbrush. She had no idea where she was, only that she needed to put distance between herself and Blackwell's men. The forest was dense here, providing cover as she made her slow, painful progress away from the water. Night was falling when she finally stopped, unable to go any farther. She found a hollow beneath a fallen tree and crawled inside, curling into a ball to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by shivers and the constant fear of pursuit. Dawn broke clear and cold. Violet awoke to the sound of birds and the distant murmur of the river. Her clothes were still damp, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she crawled from her shelter. She was alive, but for how long? She had no weapon, no horse, and no knowledge of where she was. Blackwell's men could still be searching for her, and even if they weren't, the wilderness itself was danger enough. She checked her surroundings, orienting herself by the rising sun. The mountains lay to the west. If she could reach a high point, perhaps she could spot a settlement or a ranch. It was her only hope. Violet had been walking for perhaps an hour when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. She immediately dropped to the ground, crawling beneath a thicket of scrub oak. A single rider approached, moving slowly, scanning the forest floor. It wasn't one of the men who had chased her. This one wore a battered cavalry hat and a sheepskin coat despite the spring warmth. A rifle was slung across his back, and a revolver hung at his hip. He reined in his buckskin gelding not 20 feet from her hiding place. Violet held her breath as the man dismounted, crouching to examine the ground. He was tracking someone tracking her. "I know you're there," he called, his voice low and even. "I'm not with Blackwell's bunch. If I meant you harm, I'd have let them find you yesterday." Violet remained silent, weighing her options. The man sighed, standing up straight. "Suit yourself," he said. "But you're leaving a trail a blind man could follow. They'll be back this way soon enough. I figured you might want these." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a pair of boots, her boots, and tossed them onto the ground. Then he turned back to his horse. "Wait," Violet called, her voice hoarse. She emerged cautiously from the thicket, keeping her distance. "How did you get those?" The man turned, and Violet got her first clear look at him. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 20s, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. A several-day growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and a thin scar ran along his right temple. "Found your horse," he said. "She didn't run far. Took your boots, figured you'd need them. Left the rest of your gear with her at my camp." "Who are you?" Violet demanded, still not approaching the boots. "Name's Archer Xavier," he replied. "Most folks just call me Arch." "And why would you help me, Mr. Xavier?" "Because I've got no love for Jebediah Blackwell," he answered simply. "And anyone he's hunting has my sympathy." Violet studied him, trying to decide if she could trust this stranger. Something in his direct gaze suggested honesty, but she'd learned the hard way that appearances could deceive. "How do you know Blackwell?" she asked. "Let's just say we've had dealings," Archer replied. "None of them pleasant. And you've been following me since the river." "Why not make yourself known sooner?" "Wanted to make sure you weren't being trailed," he explained. "And to be honest, wasn't sure you'd survived until I found your tracks this morning." He gestured toward the boots again. "You should take these. Walking barefoot in these mountains is asking for trouble." Violet hesitated, then stepped forward to retrieve the boots. They were still damp, but better than nothing. As she sat on a fallen log to pull them on, she kept a wary eye on the stranger. "Thank you," she said grudgingly. "You said my horse is at your camp." "About 2 miles from here," Archer nodded. "You're welcome to come collect her. Get something warm to eat." The mention of food made Violet's empty stomach clench painfully. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning before her flight from Wilson. "And then what?" she asked, standing up. "You'll send me on my way with your best wishes." A faint smile crossed Archer's face. "That depends on where you're heading. These mountains aren't safe for a lone rider, especially one being hunted. I've got a cabin up north a ways. You'd be welcome to lie low there until Blackwell's men give up the search. Why would you offer that to a complete stranger? Like I said, enemy of my enemy. He paused. Plus, it looked to me like you jumped into that river rather than surrender whatever it is Blackwell wants. That tells me something about your character. Violet considered her options. She was alone, hungry, and still weak from her ordeal in the river. If this man meant her harm, he'd had ample opportunity already. I don't even know you, she said. No, he agreed. And I don't know you either, miss. Gallagher, she supplied after a moment. Violet Gallagher. Well, Miss Gallagher, he said, swinging back into his saddle and extending a hand down to her. How about we start with breakfast and you can decide about the rest after your stomach's full? Hunger won out over caution. Violet took his hand and allowed him to pull her up behind him on the buckskin. She kept one arm wrapped around her saddlebags, the other reluctantly encircling his waist as the horse began to move through the forest. If you try anything, she warned, I'll kill me in my sleep. He finished for her. Fair enough, but all I'm offering is food and shelter. For now, she said. For now, he agreed and urged the horse into a trot. Archer's camp was well hidden in a small clearing beside a creek that fed into the Gunnison. A crude lean-to had been constructed against a rock face, and a small fire smoldered in a ring of stones. Penny was tethered nearby, raising her head at their approach and nickering in recognition of her rider. Penny. Violet slid from the buckskin's back and hurried to her mare, checking her over for injuries. Besides a few scratches, the horse seemed unharmed. Her saddle and the rest of Violet's gear were stacked neatly beside the fire. She came running right past me after you went into the river, Archer explained, dismounting and tending to his own horse. Figured she belonged to you. You were watching the whole time? Violet asked, turning to face him. Archer nodded, kneeling by the fire to stoke it back to life. I was tracking Blackwell's men. They've been causing trouble up and down the valley. Didn't expect to see them chasing a woman into the Gunnison. He glanced up at her. That was either very brave or very desperate. Both, Violet admitted, moving closer to the fire. Now that the immediate danger had passed, exhaustion was setting in. She sank down on a fallen log across from him, extending her hands toward the flames. They killed my father 3 days ago. I'm sorry to hear that, Archer said, his voice softening. He reached for a battered coffee pot beside the fire. Coffee's probably still warm. There's jerky and hardtack in my saddlebag. Thank you. Violet accepted the cup he offered, cradling it in her cold hands. What did you mean you were tracking Blackwell's men? Archer busied himself with retrieving food from his saddlebags. Blackwell's been expanding his operations. Started with mining claims, then moved into cattle. Now he's trying to control the whole valley. Anyone who stands against him has a habit of disappearing. Like my father, Violet said quietly. What was his name? Thomas Gallagher. We had a small claim up in the hills above Wilson. Not much, but it was steady. Then Blackwell decided he wanted it. And your father wouldn't sell, Archer guessed, handing her some jerky. Violet shook her head, taking a bite of the tough dried meat. They came to our cabin. 3 men said they were representing Blackwell's interests, offered a pittance for the claim. When Pa refused, they shot him, right there on our own porch. Her voice broke and she took a sip of coffee to steady herself. I was inside. They didn't know I was there or they'd have killed me too. I heard everything. And now they're after you because I have this. Violet reached into her saddlebags and withdrew the oilskin pouch. From it, she removed her father's journal. Pa's map and notes. The claim is producing well, but he found signs of a much richer vein. He was keeping it quiet until we could file the proper paperwork. Blackwell's men must have found out somehow. Archer nodded, his expression grave. Blackwell has eyes and ears everywhere. He's not the kind of man who gives up easily. Neither am I, Violet said with fierce determination. That claim is all I have left of my father. I'm not letting Blackwell steal it. What's your plan, then? Ride back to Wilson and face down Blackwell and his men alone. Archer's tone wasn't mocking, it was genuinely curious. Violet hesitated. She hadn't thought much beyond survival over the past few days. I need to reach the county seat in Gunnison. File the paperwork for the new vein before Blackwell can claim it as part of his holdings. After that, she shrugged. I don't know, sell it maybe, start fresh somewhere else. Gunnison's 3 days' ride from here, and you'd have to go right past Blackwell's ranch to get there, Archer pointed out. His men will be watching the trails. What would you suggest then? Violet challenged. Archer considered for a moment, pouring himself a cup of coffee. There's another way to Gunnison, an old trapper's trail through the high country. It's rough going, but Blackwell's men won't be watching it. And you know this trail, he nodded. I've used it before. So your offer stands, safe passage to your cabin, then on to Gunnison. Violet studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. If that's what you want, Archer replied. Though I'd recommend resting a day or two before we make for Gunnison. That river took a lot out of you. Violet couldn't argue with that. Every muscle in her body ached, and the warmth of the fire was making her eyelids heavy. Still, caution made her hesitate. Why are you helping me, really? She asked. What's in it for you? Archer's gaze dropped to the fire. Let's just say I owe Thomas Gallagher a debt. If you're his daughter, helping you is the least I can do. You knew my father. Violet was stunned. He'd never mentioned anyone named Archer. Not well, he admitted, but well enough. I was a scout for the 10th Cavalry a few years back, got ambushed by Utes up near Grand Mesa. Your father found me, patched me up, got me back to my unit, never asked for anything in return. He looked up, meeting her eyes. A man doesn't forget something like that. Violet studied him, searching for any sign of a lie. She had a good memory for her father's stories, and now that she thought about it, she vaguely recalled him mentioning a young cavalry scout he'd helped. The timing matched. She would have been about 17 then, away at school in Denver. He never mentioned your name, she said. I didn't give it, Archer replied. Wasn't much for talking in those days. Violet nodded slowly. It was plausible enough, and it explained his willingness to help. Still, caution made her add, I'm keeping my father's journal with me, and I'll be sleeping with this. She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew a small derringer that had been concealed in a hidden pocket. Archer raised an eyebrow but nodded. Fair enough. We should get moving soon, though. Blackwell's men will be widening their search. How far to your cabin? Violet asked, returning the derringer to her saddlebag but within easy reach. We can make it by nightfall if we push, he said, standing up and beginning to break camp with efficient movements. It's up in a box canyon, well hidden. We'll be safe there. Violet watched him work, still not entirely convinced of his motives but seeing few alternatives. She rose to help, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs. I need to check Penny's tack, she said, moving toward her horse. Already did, Archer replied. Cinch was loose, fixed it for you. Violet ran her hand along Penny's flank, speaking softly to the mare. The horse seemed calm enough around Archer, which was a point in his favor. Animals often sense things about people that humans missed. Within half an hour they had broken camp and were mounted, Archer leading the way through the forest. Violet followed, keeping a watchful eye on their backtrail. The day was warming, sunlight filtering through the pine boughs above. Under different circumstances, it would have been a pleasant ride. Keep your eyes open, Archer called back to her. Blackwell's got men all through these hills." "I don't need reminding," Violet replied tersely, her hand straying to the derringer tucked into her belt. Small as it was, the weapon gave her some sense of security. If Archer turned out to be leading her into a trap, he'd find she wasn't easy prey. They rode in silence for the most part, Archer occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning of rough terrain ahead. By midday, they had climbed considerably, the air growing cooler as they ascended into the mountains. They paused in a small clearing to rest the horses and eat a sparse meal of jerky and dried apples from Archer's provisions. "We're making good time," he said, scanning the valley below. "Another few hours and we'll be at the cabin." "What's up there?" Violet asked, gesturing toward the mountains ahead. "Besides your cabin, I mean." "Not much," Archer replied. "Old mining claims mostly played out, trappers' cabins. A few Ute hunting grounds, though they stay clear of white settlements these days. And Blackwell has no interests up there." "Not yet," Archer said grimly. "He's focused on the valley for now. That's where the money is. Cattle mining, the new railroad spur they're building. But men like him never stop wanting more. You seem to know a lot about him," Violet observed. Archer's expression darkened. "More than I'd like to." He stood abruptly. "We should keep moving." They mounted up and continued their ascent, the trail growing steeper and more difficult to navigate. Violet's body protested every jolt and jostle, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. The alternative, falling into Blackwell's hands, was unthinkable. By late afternoon, they had reached a ridge overlooking a small, hidden valley. A creek tumbled down from the heights, feeding a small lake at the valley's center. Nestled against the far slope, nearly invisible among the pines, stood a cabin. "There it is," Archer said, reining in his buckskin. "Home sweet home." "It's beautiful," Violet admitted, taking in the pristine valley. "How did you find this place?" "Stumbled on it when I was scouting for the cavalry," he explained. "Previous owner was an old trapper who died of mountain fever. I buried him up there." He pointed to a lone pine on a small rise above the cabin. "Figured he wouldn't mind me taking over." "And you've lived here ever since?" Archer shrugged. "Off and on. I guide hunting parties sometimes, do some trapping in winter. It's enough." "Sounds lonely," Violet observed. "Peaceful," he corrected, and nudged his horse forward down the slope. The cabin was small but sturdily built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. A lean-to served as a stable for the horses, and a smokehouse stood nearby. Everything was neat and well-maintained. Archer Xavier might live alone in the wilderness, but he wasn't careless. "You can put your things inside," he said as they dismounted. "I'll see to the horses." Violet hesitated, her instincts still wary of entering a stranger's home alone. Archer seemed to read her thoughts. "Doors unlocked," he said. "Take a look around if you want. Nothing to hide." The interior of the cabin was as neat as its exterior. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood in the center, a bed against the far wall. Shelves held books more than Violet would have expected, along with cooking utensils and supplies. A rifle rack held two long guns, and various tools hung from pegs on the walls. It was a bachelor's home, certainly, but not the crude dwelling she might have anticipated. There were even touches of refinement: a brass lamp on the table, a colorful Navajo blanket on the bed, a small collection of carved wooden animals on a shelf. Violet set her saddlebags on the table and moved to examine the books. History, poetry, a well-worn Bible, several dime novels, and, surprisingly, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets. Whoever Archer Xavier was, he wasn't a simple mountain man. She was still browsing the bookshelf when he entered, carrying an armload of firewood. "Horses are settled," he announced, kneeling to build a fire in the hearth. "There's a stream just behind the cabin if you want to wash up. Water's cold but clean." "Thank you," Violet said, suddenly very aware of her disheveled state. Her clothes were still damp in places, her hair a tangled mess. "I'd appreciate that." Archer pointed to a small chest at the foot of the bed. "There's some spare clothing in there. Won't fit right, but it's clean and dry." Violet raised an eyebrow. "You keep women's clothing in your cabin?" "My sister's," he explained. "She visits sometimes from Denver. Might be a bit big for you, but better than what you've got on." That made sense, Violet conceded, though she was still trying to reconcile this cultured cabin with the rugged man building the fire. "I'll just be a moment then," she said, moving toward the chest. She selected a simple calico dress that looked close to her size, then hesitated. "Is there somewhere I can?" "I'll wait outside," Archer said immediately, rising to his feet. "Take your time. I need to check the perimeter anyway, make sure we weren't followed." When he'd gone, Violet quickly stripped off her damp, river-stained clothing. Using water from a basin on the washstand, she cleaned herself as best she could, wincing at the bruises that mottled her skin from her battle with the rapids. The dress was indeed a bit large, but clean and comfortable. She found a comb on the washstand and worked patiently through the tangles in her hair until it hung in damp waves down her back. She had just finished when a knock came at the door. "Decent?" Archer called. "Yes," she answered, and he entered, carrying a brace of rabbits. "Thought we could use some fresh meat," he said, moving to the table to begin preparing them. "There's coffee in the tin by the fireplace if you want to make some." Violet nodded, finding the routine of making coffee strangely comforting after the chaos of the past few days. As she worked, she found herself studying Archer covertly. He moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to providing for himself, but there was nothing crude about him. Up close, she could see that the scar on his temple continued into his hairline, disappearing beneath dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Your sister visits often?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Couple times a year," he replied, his knife moving deftly over the rabbits. "She's a schoolteacher in Denver, comes up in summer when school's out. And she doesn't mind you living all the way out here." A faint smile touched his lips. "She minds, tells me I'm wasting my education hiding in the mountains." "Are you?" Violet asked before she could stop herself. Archer glanced up, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "Maybe, but it suits me." There was a story there, Violet sensed, but it wasn't her place to pry. She focused on the coffee, measuring grounds into the pot. "How long were you with the cavalry?" she asked instead. 4 years, he answered. "Signed up after the war when I was 18. Spent most of my time in these mountains, scouting. And after, did some guiding for survey teams, some hunting. Tried my hand at prospecting for a while," he shrugged. "Nothing stuck until I found this place." Violet set the coffee pot on the hook over the fire. "My father was the same way. Tried everything: railroading, cattle driving, even ran a saloon for a while. But mining was his passion. He'd light up talking about ore samples and veins." "Some men are like that," Archer agreed. "Need to follow their own star, no matter where it leads." "Even if it leads to trouble," Violet said softly, thinking of her father's stubborn refusal to be bullied by Blackwell. "Especially then," Archer replied, his voice equally quiet. He finished with the rabbits and moved to the fireplace, hanging them on spits over the flames. "Coffee smells good." They shared the meal in companionable silence as darkness fell outside. The rabbits were well cooked, seasoned with herbs Archer had gathered, and Violet found her appetite returning with surprising force. Between the hot food, the crackling fire, and the knowledge that they were safely hidden away, at least for the moment, she felt her exhaustion returning. You should take the bed, Archer said, noticing her stifling a yawn. I'll sleep by the fire. Violet hesitated. I don't want to put you out of your own bed. You're not, he assured her. I sleep out under the stars more often than not anyway. Got in the habit during my scouting days. She nodded, too tired to argue further. Wake me if you need me to take a watch. No need, he replied. We're safe enough here. Get some sleep, Violet. Tomorrow we can talk about what comes next. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and something about the way he said it made her pause. But exhaustion won out over analysis, and she made her way to the bed, sinking gratefully into its comfort. She was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. Violet woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the cabin. Sunlight streamed through the small window near the bed, suggesting it was well into morning. She sat up quickly, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. Morning, Archer greeted her from the table where he was cleaning a rifle. Thought I'd let you sleep. There's coffee on the fire and some biscuits keeping warm. What time is it? She asked, running a hand through her tangled hair. Past 9, he replied. You needed the rest. Violet couldn't argue with that. She felt better than she had in days, despite the lingering soreness in her muscles. She rose, smoothing down the borrowed dress, and made her way to the washstand to splash water on her face. Any sign of pursuit? She asked as she poured herself coffee. Archer shook his head. Checked at first light. No sign of anyone for miles, but they'll be looking. Blackwell's not a man to give up easily. Violet nodded, taking a biscuit from the pan by the fire. It was surprisingly good. Archer clearly knew his way around a kitchen as well as the wilderness. So what's the plan? She asked, taking a seat across from him at the table. You mentioned a trail to Gunnison. I did, he agreed, reassembling the rifle with practiced movements. But there's something you should know before we go any further. He set the weapon aside and looked at her directly. Blackwell's got the county judge in his pocket. Even if you make it to Gunnison and file your claim, he'll find a way to challenge it. Violet frowned. How can you be sure? Because I've seen it happen before, Archer replied grimly. 2 years ago, a man named Harlow tried to stand against Blackwell over water rights. Had all the proper documentation, clear title to the land and the water that ran through it. Judge ruled against him anyway on a technicality. Harlow appealed, but before the case could be heard, he was found dead, supposedly kicked by his own horse. A chill ran down Violet's spine. So you're saying it's hopeless? No, Archer said firmly. I'm saying we need a different approach. The territorial governor is due in Gunnison next week for the railroad celebration. He's no friend to Blackwell, in fact. There are rumors he's been looking for a reason to investigate him. If we can get your father's journal and map to him, bypass the local authorities entirely. We might have a chance, Violet finished, hope stirring within her. But can we trust the governor? More than we can trust the local law, Archer replied. Governor Rout built his reputation on standing up to corrupt mining interests back in Central City. If anyone will give you a fair hearing, it's him. Violet considered this, turning the coffee cup in her hands. So we hide here until the governor arrives in Gunnison. That's my suggestion, Archer nodded. We're well stocked and Blackwell's men won't find us here. Once his search moves on, we can make our way down to Gunnison in time for the celebration. You'll have your chance to speak to the governor directly. It was a sensible plan, Violet had to admit. Better than her half-formed notion of riding straight to Gunnison and throwing herself on the mercy of authorities who might already be in Blackwell's pocket. All right, she agreed. But I won't sit idle for a week. I need to review my father's notes, make sure I understand everything in case the governor has questions. Fair enough, Archer said, rising from the table. I need to check our supplies anyway, make sure we've got enough to last. The garden could use tending too. He paused. You're welcome to look around outside if you want. Just stay within sight of the cabin for now, until we're certain it's safe. Violet nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and trepidation. A week in this isolated cabin with a man she barely knew, yet there was something about Archer Xavier that inspired trust, despite her caution. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Archer spent the mornings hunting or checking his trap lines, returning by midday with game or fish. Violet took over much of the cooking, grateful to have something useful to do. In the afternoons, she worked in the small garden beside the cabin while Archer repaired equipment or split firewood. Evenings were spent by the fire, Violet studying her father's journal while Archer read or carved the small wooden figures she had noticed on the shelf. They talked, too hesitantly at first, then with growing ease. Archer told her about his sister Catherine, who had raised him after their parents died in a cholera outbreak. Violet spoke of her schooling in Denver, arranged by her father who had insisted she have advantages he never had. He wanted me to stay there, she admitted on the third night as they sat before the fire. Find a respectable husband, live a civilized life, but I couldn't bear to be away from him. He was all the family I had. He must have been proud of you, Archer said quietly. Coming back, learning the mining business. He was, Violet smiled at the memory. Said I had a better eye for ore samples than most men he'd worked with. We were going to expand the claim, hire some workers once we confirmed the new vein. Her smile faded. He had such plans. And now they're yours, Archer observed. Violet looked up, meeting his gaze across the fire. Yes, though I don't know if I can do it alone. You don't have to, he said simply, then seemed to catch himself. I mean, once this business with Blackwell is settled, there are honest men who'd work a claim for fair wages. Violet nodded, though something in his initial response had sent a curious warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. On the fourth day, they rode out together to check the approaches to the valley, making sure Blackwell's search hadn't ventured this far into the mountains. The day was clear and cool, the landscape painted in the vibrant greens of late spring. It's beautiful up here, Violet observed as they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. Peaceful. That's why I stay, Archer replied, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Most men see the mountains as something to conquer or exploit. I see them as a refuge. From what? Violet asked, turning to look at him. Archer was silent for a long moment. From the worst parts of what men do to each other, he finally said. I saw enough of that during and after the war. Violet remembered what her father had told her about the aftermath of the Civil War, the bitterness, the violent clashes as people tried to rebuild their lives among the ruins of the old order. Were you in the war? She asked softly. Archer shook his head. Too young, but my father was. He came back, changed, died not long after. His gaze remained fixed on the distant peaks. That's when Catherine and I headed west. She took a teaching position in Denver. I joined the cavalry. It explained something about him. Violet thought the self-sufficiency, the wariness, the preference for solitude. Yet he had taken her in without hesitation, risked himself to help her. Thank you, she said suddenly, for everything you've done. Archer turned to her, surprise flickering across his features. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do, Violet insisted. You could have ignored what was happening at the river, could have left me to fend for myself. Instead, you've risked making an enemy of Blackwell. Blackwell was already my enemy, he replied with a faint smile. And I couldn't leave you to drown. What kind of man would that make me? The kind who survives in this country, Violet said bluntly. There's surviving and there's living, Archer countered. I learned the difference a long time ago. They rode back to the cabin in companionable silence, the sun beginning its descent toward the western peaks. As they approached, Archer suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for Violet to stop. "What is it?" she whispered, immediately alert. Archer pointed to the ground before them. Fresh hoofprints marked the earth, at least 2 horses, heading toward the cabin. "Someone's found us," he said grimly, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay close." They dismounted, tethering their horses to a tree, and proceeded on foot, moving silently through the underbrush. As they neared the cabin, Violet could see 2 horses hitched to the rail outside, neither of which she recognized. "Blackwell's men," she breathed. Archer shook his head slightly. "Don't think so. They're not trying to hide their presence." He studied the cabin and the surrounding area carefully. "Wait here. Cover me with this." He handed her his Winchester. "Archer," she began to protest. "If it is Blackwell's men, I need to know how many," he said. "Stay hidden. If something happens to me, ride east. There's a ranger station about 10 miles over the ridge." Before she could argue further, he moved away, keeping to the cover of the trees as he circled toward the cabin. Violet positioned herself behind a fallen log, the rifle steady in her hands. She had fired guns before her father had insisted she learn, but never at a person. She prayed she wouldn't have to now. Archer reached the edge of the clearing, remaining concealed as he observed the cabin. The door was open, and he could hear voices inside, though not clearly enough to make out words. Drawing his revolver, he moved silently across the open ground to the side of the cabin, pressing himself against the wall beside the window. Violet watched, her heart pounding as Archer peered quickly through the window, then ducked back. A moment later, to her surprise, he holstered his weapon and stepped around to the front of the cabin, entering openly. Confused, Violet remained where she was, the rifle trained on the doorway. Minutes ticked by with no sounds of conflict. Finally, Archer appeared in the doorway and waved to her, indicating it was safe. Cautiously, Violet emerged from her hiding place, the Winchester still in hand as she approached the cabin. Archer met her halfway, a wry expression on his face. "It's not Blackwell's men," he said. "It's my sister. She's brought a friend from town." "Your sister?" Violet repeated, bewildered. "I thought she only visited in summer." "Apparently she got word of trouble in the valley and came to check on me," Archer explained, taking the rifle from her. "Catherine has a protective streak a mile wide." Violet followed him to the cabin, unsure what to expect. Inside, she found a tall, dark-haired woman who bore a strong resemblance to Archer, and a balding, middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. "Violet, this is my sister Catherine Xavier," Archer made the introductions. "And this is Frederick Wheaton, editor of the Gunnison Gazette." Catherine stepped forward, extending her hand with a warm smile. "So you're Violet Gallagher." "I'm very pleased to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "How did you know who I am?" Violet asked, taking the offered hand in confusion. "That would be my doing," Wheaton interjected, rising from his seat at the table. "News travels fast in a small territory, Miss Gallagher, especially when it involves Jebediah Blackwell. When I heard Thomas Gallagher's daughter had disappeared after his murder, and that Blackwell's men were searching the backcountry, I put 2 and 2 together. Mr. Wheaton has been gathering evidence against Blackwell for months," Catherine explained. "He's been working with the territorial governor's office." Violet looked between them, hope and caution warring within her. "And you came looking for me. Why?" "Because Blackwell has gone too far this time," Wheaton said firmly. "Murdering a respected miner like your father in cold blood, even his money can't cover that up entirely. But we need witnesses, evidence." "When Catherine mentioned her brother had a cabin up here, I thought it worth checking if you might have sought refuge with him." It was a lucky guess, Catherine added. I didn't know Archer had actually found you. Violet turned to Archer. You knew about this. About Mr. Wheaton's investigation. Not until just now, Archer replied, looking as surprised as she felt. Catherine's letter only mentioned she was bringing a friend who needed a quiet place to work on a story. I couldn't put details in writing, Catherine explained. Not with Blackwell's men watching the male stage. Wheaton moved to the table, where he had spread out several documents. Miss Gallagher, if you're willing, I'd like to hear your account of what happened to your father. Combined with the evidence I've already gathered, your testimony could be enough for the governor to order a formal investigation, one that bypasses the local authorities. Violet hesitated, looking to Archer. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. Wheaton's reputation is solid, he said quietly. If anyone can bring this to light, it's him. Violet took a deep breath and moved to the table. I have more than just my testimony, she said, retrieving her father's journal from her saddlebags. I have his map and notes. It's what Blackwell's men are after. Wheaton's eyes widened as she spread the journal before him. This is exactly what we need, he breathed. Proof of your father's claim, evidence of Blackwell's motive. For the next several hours, Violet recounted everything: her father's discovery of the new vein, Blackwell's interest in the claim, the confrontation that had ended in murder, and her own narrow escape. Wheaton took copious notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. Catherine prepared a meal as they talked, and Archer remained near the door, keeping watch in case their visitors had been followed. The governor arrives in Gunnison the day after tomorrow, Wheaton said finally, setting down his pencil. With your permission, Miss Gallagher, I'd like to present all of this to him directly. If he acts quickly, we can have federal marshals investigating Blackwell before the week is out. And what about Violet? Archer asked from his position by the door. Blackwell's men are still searching for her. She should come with us to Gunnison, Catherine suggested. We have friends there who can provide safe lodging until the governor acts. Wheaton nodded agreement. The governor will want to hear your testimony firsthand, Miss Gallagher. And you'll be safer in town, under the eyes of people who aren't in Blackwell's pocket, than out here alone. She won't be alone, Archer said quietly, his gaze meeting Violet's across the room. I'll be with her. Something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken understanding, a recognition of a bond that had formed over the past days. Violet felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. All the more reason you should both come to Gunnison, Catherine said, looking between them with a knowing expression. The governor's reception is the day after his arrival. Respectable citizens from across the territory will be there, the perfect setting for Miss Gallagher to present her case publicly, where Blackwell can't interfere without revealing himself. It's risky, Archer cautioned. Blackwell will have men watching the town. Which is why we'll travel separately, Wheaton proposed. Catherine and I will leave at first light, taking the main trail. You and Miss Gallagher can follow the next day, using your trapper's route. We'll meet at Judge Hollister's home. He's no friend to Blackwell, and his house is large enough to accommodate guests without raising suspicion. It was a sound plan, Violet had to admit, better than hiding in the mountains hoping for Blackwell's interest to wane. All right, she agreed. We'll come to Gunnison. Later that night, after Catherine and Wheaton had retired to the lean-to Archer had prepared for them, Violet found herself unable to sleep. She sat by the dying fire, her father's journal open in her lap, though she wasn't reading it, nervous about tomorrow. Archer's voice came softly from the darkness. He sat in a chair by the window, keeping watch. Yes, she admitted, but hopeful too. For the first time since my father died, I feel like there might be justice. Archer moved to sit beside her, adding a small log to the fire. "There will be," he promised. "Blackwell's been building enemies for years. This might be what finally brings him down." "And after?" Violet asked, looking up at him. "What happens then?" In the flickering firelight, Archer's expression was thoughtful. "That depends on you," he said. "Your father's claim will be secure. You could work it yourself, hire men to help, or sell it and start fresh somewhere else like you mentioned before." "And what would you do?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Archer was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I've been thinking about that," he finally said. "This cabin's been a good refuge, but maybe it's time for a change." "What kind of change?" He turned to look at her directly. "I'm not sure yet, but I know I don't want to go back to living alone in these mountains." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. In just a few days, something had changed for both of them. What had begun as a rescue, an obligation based on an old debt, had become something else entirely. "Archer," Violet began, then hesitated, uncertain how to express the tumult of emotions she was feeling. "You don't have to say anything," he assured her. "We hardly know each other, and there's a lot happening right now. But when this is over, when you're safe and Blackwell is facing justice, maybe we could talk about what comes next." Violet nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'd like that." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, watching the fire slowly die to embers. When Violet finally retired to the bed, sleep came more easily than she had expected. Her dreams for once unmarred by the trauma of the past week. Morning brought a flurry of activity as Catherine and Wheaton prepared to depart for Gunnison. Maps were consulted, plans finalized, contingencies discussed. If all went well, they would reach town by nightfall, and Archer and Violet would join them the following evening. "Be careful, little brother," Catherine said as she embraced Archer beside the horses. "Blackwell's men are all through the valley." "We'll be fine," Archer assured her. "The high trail is safe enough and we'll approach town after dark." Catherine turned to Violet, taking her hands. "I'm glad Archer found you," she said warmly, "for more reasons than one." Violet felt herself blushing but returned the older woman's smile. "So am I." As they watched the two riders disappear down the trail, Archer turned to Violet. "We should prepare to leave at first light tomorrow. It's a long day's ride to Gunnison by the high trail." The day passed quickly as they gathered supplies, checked their weapons, and packed only what was essential for the journey. Violet's father's journal was carefully wrapped in oilskin and placed in her saddlebags. Along with a change of clothes, Catherine had left for her more suitable for a governor's reception than the borrowed dress she'd been wearing. As evening approached, they shared a simple meal, both too preoccupied with thoughts of the journey ahead to engage in much conversation. It wasn't until they were sitting before the fire, as had become their custom, that Archer broke the silence. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his expression serious. "About Blackwell." Violet looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. "What about him?" "My history with him goes deeper than I've said." Archer's gaze was fixed on the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "He's the reason I live up here, away from people." Violet set the book aside, giving him her full attention. "What happened?" Archer drew a deep breath. 5 years ago, I was guiding a survey team for the railroad. We were mapping possible routes through the territory. One of the routes would have bypassed land Blackwell had just acquired, land he'd bought specifically because he believed the railroad would have to pass through it. "And he wasn't happy about your survey," Violet guessed. "No," Archer confirmed grimly. "He sent men to persuade us to alter our findings. When that failed, they attacked our camp one night. 3 good men died. I was wounded but managed to escape." His hand moved unconsciously to the scar at his temple. I tried to bring charges, but the local judge, the same one who's in Blackwell's pocket, now dismissed my claims for lack of evidence. So you retreated to the mountains, Violet said softly. Archer nodded. I'd lost faith in justice. Figured the best I could do was stay out of Blackwell's way, help others do the same when I could. His eyes met hers. Until you. What's different about me? Violet asked, though something in her heart already knew the answer. Everything, he said simply. Your courage. Your determination to fight rather than run. And, he hesitated. The way I feel when I'm with you. The admission hung between them, raw and honest in the quiet cabin. Violet felt her heart quicken, emotions she'd been trying to suppress rising to the surface. I feel it too, she whispered. I barely know you, but somehow. I know, Archer said, reaching out to take her hand. His touch was warm, calloused, but gentle. It doesn't make sense, not with everything that's happening, not with the danger we're still facing. Maybe it's because of the danger, Violet suggested, her fingers curling around his. Everything feels more intense, more immediate. Maybe, Archer agreed, but I think it would be there anyway. Some things just are. He raised his other hand to her cheek, a question in his eyes. Violet answered by leaning into his touch, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that was tentative at first, then deepening as uncertainty gave way to mutual desire. When they finally broke apart, Violet remained close, her forehead resting against his. When this is over, she murmured, when Blackwell is dealt with and my father's claim is secure. What then? Archer's thumb traced the line of her jaw. Then we figure it out together, he said, if that's what you want. It is, Violet affirmed and kissed him again, a seal on a promise still taking shape between them. They spent the night in each other's arms, finding comfort and connection in the face of the uncertainty that lay ahead. When dawn broke, they rose and prepared for the journey with a new sense of purpose, not just justice for Violet's father, but a future they might build together. The high trail to Gunnison was as challenging as Archer had warned. It climbed steeply into the mountains, following game paths and ancient Indian routes that few white men knew. They rode single file, Archer leading, both alert for any sign of danger. How much farther? Violet asked as they paused to rest the horses around midday. We're about halfway, Archer replied, scanning the valley below. Should reach the outskirts of town by nightfall. The view from their elevation was spectacular, the valley spread out below them, the Gunnison River a silver ribbon winding through green meadows and stands of pine. In the far distance, Violet could just make out the smoke from chimneys marking the town of Gunnison. It's hard to believe there's so much beauty in a place with men like Blackwell, she mused. That's why men like Blackwell want to own it, Archer said. They think they can possess beauty, control it. Like my father's claim, Violet nodded. It wasn't just the gold he wanted, it was the power to take something that belonged to someone else. Exactly, Archer agreed. But he doesn't understand what your father knew, that the real value is in the work, the discovery, the connection to the land, not just what you can take from it. They continued their journey, the trail growing narrower as it wound along ridgelines and through hidden valleys. By late afternoon, they had begun their descent toward Gunnison, the town now clearly visible in the distance. We'll approach from the east, Archer explained as they paused to water the horses at a small spring. Judge Hollister's home is on the edge of town, near the church. We should be able to reach it without being seen if we wait until dark. Violet nodded, though anxiety was building within her as they drew closer to town. Everything would come to a head in the next 24 hours: the meeting with the governor, the public accusation against Blackwell, the hope for justice. And underlying it all, the uncertain future that lay beyond. They made camp in a sheltered hollow as the sun began to set, not daring to risk a fire that might be spotted from below. They shared a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, watching as lights began to appear in the town. "Nervous?" Archer asked, noting Violet's silence. "Yes," she admitted. "Not about facing Blackwell or the governor, about what comes after." She looked at him in the fading light. "I've never planned beyond the next day, the next week. My life was with my father working our claim. Now you have choices," Archer finished for her. "And that's frightening in its own way." "Yes," she nodded, "but exciting too." She reached for his hand in the gathering darkness, "especially if I'm not facing those choices alone." Archer's fingers intertwined with hers. "You won't be," he promised, "whatever you decide." They waited until the town had settled for the night before continuing their descent. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by as they approached Gunnison from the east, as planned. The church steeple was visible against the night sky, guiding them toward Judge Hollister's home nearby. The judge's residence was a large, two-story house set back from the road, surrounded by a wrought iron fence. A lantern burned by the gate, and as they approached, a figure emerged from the shadows of the porch. "Archer," Catherine's voice was a hushed whisper. "It's us," Archer confirmed, dismounting and helping Violet down from her mare. Catherine hurried to meet them, embracing her brother briefly before turning to Violet. "Thank goodness you're here safely. We were beginning to worry. Any trouble on your journey?" Archer asked as they led the horses around to the back of the house. "None," Catherine replied. "Though Blackwell's men are all over town. The governor arrived this afternoon and the reception is tomorrow evening at the hotel." She glanced at Violet. "Mr. Wheaton has arranged for you to meet with the governor privately beforehand." A groom appeared to take their horses, and Catherine led them into the house through the back entrance. Judge Hollister, a distinguished man with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, greeted them in the kitchen. "Miss Gallagher," he said, taking her hand, "I'm deeply sorry about your father. He was a good man." "Thank you, Your Honor," Violet replied. "I appreciate your help." "Justice is my duty," the judge said gravely, "and justice has been in short supply where Jebediah Blackwell is concerned." He turned to Archer. "Good to see you again, Xavier. Been too long since you've come to town." "I prefer the mountains, Judge," Archer replied with a faint smile. "Fewer complications." "Yet here you are, in the middle of the biggest complication this territory has seen in years," the judge observed wryly. "Come, you must be hungry. Catherine has prepared a late supper, and Wheaton is waiting to discuss tomorrow's plans." They followed him to a small dining room where Wheaton sat at a table laden with food. The newspaper editor rose as they entered, his expression brightening at the sight of Violet. "Miss Gallagher, thank goodness," he said, coming forward to shake her hand. "I've spoken with the governor, and he's most eager to hear your testimony." Over supper, they discussed the plan for the following day. Violet would meet privately with Governor Rout before the reception, presenting her father's journal and her own account of his murder. The governor would then announce at the reception his intention to launch a federal investigation into Blackwell's activities. "What about Blackwell himself?" Violet asked. "Won't he be at the reception?" "Almost certainly," Wheaton confirmed. "He never misses an opportunity to curry favor with territorial officials." "Is that safe?" Archer frowned. "Having Violet in the same room with him?" "It's precisely because it's a public gathering that you'll be safe," Judge Hollister explained. "Blackwell wouldn't dare act openly against you with the governor and half the respectable citizens of the territory as witnesses." "Besides," Catherine added, "you won't be alone. Archer will be with you, and the governor will have his own security." They discussed details late into the night before Catherine finally showed them to their rooms, separate chambers on the second floor of the judge's spacious home. As Violet prepared for bed, a soft knock came at her door. "It's Catherine," a voice called. "May I come in?" Violet opened the door to find Archer's sister holding a large box. "I thought you might need something suitable for the reception tomorrow," Catherine explained, entering and placing the box on the bed. "This should fit you." Inside was a beautiful gown of deep blue silk, simply cut but elegant. "It's lovely," Violet breathed, touching the fabric. "But I couldn't—" "Nonsense," Catherine interrupted with a smile. "It's my gift to you. A woman should look her best when confronting her enemies." She paused, studying Violet's face, "and when standing beside the man she cares for." Violet felt herself blushing. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who knows Archer as well as I do," Catherine replied. "I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Her expression grew serious. "My brother has been alone too long, hiding in those mountains. Whatever happens tomorrow, I hope you'll consider what might be possible between you." "I already am," Violet admitted. "If we get through this—" "When you get through this," Catherine corrected firmly. "Blackwell's day of reckoning has been a long time coming. Tomorrow it finally arrives." She squeezed Violet's hand. "Get some rest. You'll need your strength." After Catherine left, Violet found herself too restless to sleep immediately. She moved to the window, looking out at the quiet town. Somewhere out there, Blackwell and his men were also preparing for tomorrow, though they didn't yet know the reckoning that awaited them. A soft tap at her door roused her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Archer still dressed, his expression troubled. "I couldn't sleep," he explained quietly. "Wanted to make sure you were all right." Violet stepped back to let him in. "I'm nervous," she admitted, "but ready for this to be over." Archer nodded, moving to the window where she had been standing. "Judge Hollister received word just after you retired. Blackwell's men are watching the roads into town. They know something's happening." "Do they know I'm here?" Violet asked, alarm flaring within her. "No," Archer assured her, "but they're suspicious. Blackwell has doubled his men for the reception tomorrow." Violet absorbed this news, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll need to be twice as careful," she said. "But I won't back down, Archer. I can't." "I know," he replied, turning to face her. "And I wouldn't ask you to, but I want you to be prepared. Tomorrow won't be easy." "Nothing worth fighting for ever is," Violet said, moving to stand before him. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar at his temple. "You taught me that." Archer caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Try to get some sleep," he murmured. "I'll be right across the hall if you need me." After he left, Violet found that sleep came more easily than she had expected. Perhaps it was the knowledge that after weeks of running and hiding, she was finally taking a stand. Or perhaps it was simply the comfort of knowing Archer was nearby, a steadfast presence in the storm that had become her life. Morning brought a flurry of activity to the Hollister household. Messengers came and went, delivering updates on the governor's schedule and Blackwell's movements. By midday, all was in readiness. The private meeting with Governor Rout was set for 4 o'clock at the hotel. 2 hours before the reception would begin, Violet spent the afternoon preparing, Catherine helping her dress and style her hair. The blue silk gown fit perfectly, transforming her from a roughened frontier woman into someone who could stand confidently before the territorial governor. "You look beautiful," Catherine declared as Violet examined her reflection in the mirror. "Your father would be proud." "Thank you," Violet said, touching the locket at her throat, the only piece of jewelry she owned, containing a small portrait of her father. "For everything." Downstairs, they found Archer waiting in the parlor, dressed in a black suit that Catherine had insisted he wear. He stood as they entered, his expression changing from tension to wonder as he saw Violet. "You look," he began, then seemed at a loss for words. "So do you," Violet replied with a small smile, taking in his transformed appearance. The rugged mountain man was still there in his bearing, and the weathered tan of his face, but the suit lent him a distinguished air that suited him surprisingly well. Judge Hollister's carriage was waiting outside to take them to the hotel. As they prepared to leave, the judge drew Archer aside for a brief, private word. Violet couldn't hear what was said, but she noticed Archer checking his revolver before concealing it beneath his jacket. The streets of Gunnison were busier than usual, townspeople and visitors alike preparing for the governor's reception. As their carriage approached the hotel, the grandest building in town, though modest by Denver standards, Violet could see men she recognized as Blackwells watching the entrance. "Keep your head high," Catherine advised from beside her. "You have nothing to fear and everything to gain." The carriage stopped at the hotel's side entrance, away from prying eyes. Judge Hollister led them inside and up a back staircase to a suite on the second floor. Frederick Wheaton was waiting for them, along with a distinguished-looking man Violet recognized from newspaper engravings as Governor Rout. "Miss Gallagher," the governor greeted her, stepping forward to take her hand. "I cannot express how sorry I am about your father. Thomas Gallagher was known to me by reputation, an honest miner and a credit to this territory." "Thank you, Governor," Violet replied, summoning her courage. "That means a great deal." "Mr. Wheaton has told me something of your situation," the governor continued, gesturing for her to sit. "But I'd like to hear the full account from you directly." For the next hour, Violet recounted everything: her father's discovery of the new vein, Blackwell's attempts to buy the claim, the murder she had witnessed, and her own narrow escape. She presented her father's journal and map, which the governor examined with great interest. "This is compelling evidence," he said finally, closing the journal. "Combined with the other reports Mr. Wheaton has gathered about Blackwell's activities, it paints a disturbing picture of corruption and violence." "Will it be enough, Governor?" Judge Hollister asked. "Blackwell has powerful friends, even in Denver." "It will be enough," the governor assured them firmly. "I came to Gunnison prepared to act if the evidence warranted it. It does." He turned to Violet. "With your permission, Miss Gallagher, I will announce at the reception tonight my intention to appoint a special investigator with federal authority to examine all aspects of Jebediah Blackwell's business dealings, beginning with your father's murder." "Thank you, Governor," Violet said, relief washing through her. "There is one more thing," the governor added. "The announcement will have more impact if you are present when I make it. Blackwell will be there, of course. Are you prepared to face him?" Violet felt Archer tense beside her, but her own resolve was unwavering. "Yes, Governor. I've been prepared since the day he had my father killed." The governor nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Very well. The reception begins at 6. Judge Hollister will escort you in." "I'll make the announcement at 7. He turned to Archer. "And you, Mr. Xavier, I understand you've been Miss Gallagher's protector in this affair." "I have," Archer confirmed. "Then I'll count on you to continue in that role tonight," the governor said. "Blackwell won't take this lying down, even with witnesses present." As they left the governor's suite to prepare for the reception, Violet felt a curious calm descend over her. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, the end was in sight. Justice for her father was within reach. The hotel ballroom was already crowded when they arrived for the reception. Gunnison's leading citizens mingled with visitors from across the territory, all eager for a glimpse of the governor. Violet entered on Judge Hollister's arm, with Archer and Catherine close behind. "There's Blackwell," Catherine murmured. nodding discreetly toward a group near the center of the room. Violet followed her gaze and saw him for the first time, a tall, imposing man in his 50s, expensively dressed, with iron-gray hair and cold eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was surrounded by associates, including the 3 men who had chased her to the river. As if sensing her scrutiny, Blackwell looked up, his gaze locking with hers across the room. For a moment, confusion flickered across his features. Then recognition dawned, followed by a calculated mask of indifference. He murmured something to one of his men, who immediately slipped away toward the exit. "He's seen you," Archer said quietly at her shoulder. "Stay close to me." They moved through the crowd, accepting introductions from Judge Hollister to various dignitaries. All the while, Violet was acutely aware of Blackwell's presence, though he made no move toward them. At precisely 7 o'clock, Governor Rout stepped onto the small dais at the front of the room. A hush fell over the gathering as he prepared to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," the governor began, "it is my pleasure to be here in Gunnison to celebrate the progress this fine community has made. The coming of the railroad heralds a new era of prosperity for this region." He continued with pleasantries for several minutes before his tone grew more serious. "However, progress must never come at the expense of justice. It has come to my attention that serious allegations have been made concerning business practices in this territory, allegations that include fraud, intimidation, and even murder." A murmur ran through the crowd. Violet felt Archer's hand at the small of her back, a steadying presence. "As your governor, I cannot and will not ignore such allegations," Rout continued. "Therefore, I am announcing tonight the appointment of a special investigator with federal authority to examine these matters thoroughly. This investigation will begin with the recent murder of Thomas Gallagher, a respected miner whose claim was coveted by others." All eyes in the room turned toward Blackwell, who maintained an expression of calm indifference. "I am especially gratified that Mr. Gallagher's daughter, Violet, is here with us tonight," the governor said, extending his hand toward her. "Miss Gallagher has shown tremendous courage in coming forward with evidence of the circumstances surrounding her father's death." Violet stepped forward, her head held high as she joined the governor on the dais. From this vantage point, she could see Blackwell clearly, the mask of indifference slipping to reveal a cold fury beneath. "Miss Gallagher has provided documentation that will form the cornerstone of our investigation," the governor announced. "I ask all law-abiding citizens of this territory to support our efforts to ensure that justice is served." As applause broke out, Violet noticed movement at the back of the room. Blackwell's men were positioning themselves near the exits. Archer saw it too, moving closer to the dais, one hand inside his jacket where his revolver was concealed. The governor concluded his remarks and escorted Violet back to where Archer and the others waited. As the crowd resumed its conversations, now buzzing with the governor's announcement, Blackwell made his move. He approached their group directly, his face a mask of cordial concern. "Governor Rout," he greeted, ignoring the others. "A bold announcement. I trust you've verified these allegations thoroughly before making them public." "The evidence speaks for itself, Blackwell," the governor replied coolly. "The special investigator will arrive from Denver next week. I suggest you cooperate fully." "Of course," Blackwell said smoothly. "I have nothing to hide." His gaze shifted to Violet. "Miss Gallagher, I believe, I was deeply saddened to hear about your father, a tragic accident." "It was no accident," Violet replied, her voice steady despite the hatred coursing through her. "Your men shot him in cold blood when he refused to sell his claim." "A serious accusation," Blackwell said, unperturbed, "and one without witnesses, I believe." "I witnessed it," Violet stated firmly. I heard everything from inside our cabin, and my father's journal provides the motive. Something dangerous flickered in Blackwell's eyes. Journals can be forged, and the testimony of a grieving daughter desperate to cast blame. He shook his head. The courts will require more substantial evidence. They'll have it, Archer interjected, stepping forward. Thomas Gallagher wasn't your first victim, Blackwell, but he will be your last. Recognition dawned on Blackwell's face as he took in Archer's scarred temple. Xavier, he said softly, I thought you'd learned your lesson about interfering in my affairs. I learned that men like you don't stop until someone stops them, Archer replied evenly. Blackwell's gaze traveled between Archer and Violet, noting their proximity, the protective stance Archer had adopted. A cold smile touched his lips. How touching, he said. The mountain recluse and the miner's daughter united in their misguided crusade. He leaned closer, his voice dropping so only they could hear. Enjoy your victory tonight. It won't last. By the time your special investigator arrives, evidence has a way of disappearing. Witnesses too. Is that a threat, Blackwell? The governor demanded, having overheard the last part. Merely an observation about the frontier, Blackwell replied smoothly. Things are unpredictable out here. With a slight bow, he turned and moved away through the crowd, his men falling in behind him. He won't give up so easily, Judge Hollister muttered. Governor, I suggest we arrange protection for Miss Gallagher until the investigator arrives. Already done, the governor assured him. I've wired Denver for federal marshals. They'll be here within 2 days. He turned to Violet. Until then, I'd advise staying somewhere secure. Blackwell would be a fool to act against you now, but he's a desperate man. She'll be safe with me, Archer said firmly. The remainder of the reception passed without incident, though Violet was conscious of being watched by Blackwell's men who remained at the edges of the gathering. When it was finally time to leave, Archer insisted they exit through the kitchen, avoiding the main entrance where Blackwell's men might be waiting. Judge Hollister's carriage returned them to his home, where a late supper awaited. The mood was cautiously optimistic. The governor's public announcement had set wheels in motion that even Blackwell would find difficult to stop. The next few days are critical, Wheaton said as they discussed the evening's events over coffee. Once the marshals arrive and the investigation formally begins, Blackwell's influence will be significantly curtailed. But until then, he's dangerous, Archer pointed out. More dangerous than ever because he's cornered. Which is why you both should remain here, Judge Hollister insisted. My home is the safest place in Gunnison right now. Violet nodded her agreement, though her thoughts were already turning to what would come after. The governor had assured her that her father's claim would be protected during the investigation, but what then? Would she stay and work it, as she and her father had planned? Or would she sell it and start anew elsewhere? And what of Archer? The connection between them had deepened over the past week, evolving from rescuer and rescued to something far more profound. But she still knew so little about his plans, his desires beyond seeing Blackwell brought to justice. Later that night, as the household settled, Violet found herself unable to sleep. She donned a robe over her nightgown and made her way downstairs, thinking a cup of tea might help. She was surprised to find Archer in the kitchen, similarly sleepless. "Can't rest?" he asked, looking up from the cup of coffee he'd been nursing at the table. "Too much happening," she admitted, moving to the stove where a kettle still steamed. "My mind won't quiet, mine either." Archer watched as she prepared her tea. "You were magnificent tonight, standing up to Blackwell like that." Violet smiled faintly as she joined him at the table. "I was terrified inside, but I kept thinking of my father, how he never backed down from what he believed was right. He'd be proud of you," Archer said softly. They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Violet gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "What will you do, Archer, when this is over and Blackwell is facing justice? Will you go back to your cabin in the mountains?" He considered the question, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I don't think so," he said finally. "Being back among people these past days, it's reminded me of what I've been missing. The cabin was a refuge when I needed one, but maybe it's time for something else." "Like what?" Violet pressed gently. Archer looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "That depends partly on you," he said. "On what you decide to do with your father's claim." Violet felt her heart quicken. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "I don't want to sell it. It was his dream, his life's work, but I'm not sure I can manage it alone." "You wouldn't have to," Archer said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "If you wanted a partner." The offer hung between them, fraught with meaning beyond a simple business arrangement. Violet laced her fingers through his, considering the possibilities it presented. "A partner," she repeated thoughtfully. "In the claim, and perhaps in other things." A smile touched Archer's lips. "That would be my hope." Violet felt a surge of emotion, hope, fear, excitement all mingled together. "We barely know each other," she pointed out, though her tone belied her words. "We know what matters," Archer replied. "The rest we can discover together." He paused, his expression growing serious. "I know this is sudden. After everything you've been through, the last thing you need is more uncertainty. If you need time—" "No," Violet interrupted, squeezing his hand. "I've had enough of waiting, of fear, of looking over my shoulder. What I want now is to build something, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather build it with than you." The smile that spread across Archer's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. The kiss they shared was a promise, a beginning. A sudden crash from the front of the house shattered the moment. They broke apart, instantly alert. Shouts followed, then the sound of breaking glass. "Blackwell's men," Archer said grimly, reaching for the revolver he'd left on the counter. "Get upstairs, wake the others." Before Violet could move, the kitchen door burst open. Two men rushed in, guns drawn. Archer fired, hitting the first man in the shoulder. The second got off a shot that splintered the doorframe near Archer's head. Violet grabbed a cast iron pan from the stove and swung it with all her strength, catching the second man on the side of the head. He went down hard, his gun clattering across the floor. More shouts came from elsewhere in the house. The judge's voice, Catherine's scream. Archer grabbed Violet's arm, pulling her toward the back door. "We need to get out of here," he urged. "There are too many of them." They burst into the yard behind the house, running for the stable. Two of the judge's servants were already there, alerted by the commotion. They had the horses saddled by the time Archer and Violet reached them. "Get word to the sheriff," Archer instructed one of the men. "Tell him Blackwell's attacking the judge's home." They mounted quickly, Violet gathering the reins of her mare with hands that shook with adrenaline. Behind them, the sounds of conflict continued in the house. "We can't just leave them," she protested as Archer led them toward the back gate. "We're not," he assured her. "The sheriff's office is 2 blocks away. We'll go there directly and bring help." But as they emerged onto the street, 3 riders appeared, blocking their path. Blackwell's men, no doubt part of a coordinated attack. "This way," Archer shouted, wheeling his buckskin around. Violet followed as he led them down an alley, hooves clattering on the hard, packed earth. Shots rang out behind them. Violet ducked low over Penny's neck, urging the mare to greater speed. They emerged onto another street, then another alley, trying to lose their pursuers in the warren of Gunnison's back streets. "The river," Archer called over his shoulder. We can cross at the ford and head for the mountains." Violet nodded, understanding his plan. If they could reach the high country, they could evade Blackwell's men until the marshals arrived from Denver. She had escaped once by river. Perhaps it would be their salvation again. They rode hard for the outskirts of town, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. The Gunnison River gleamed in the moonlight ahead, its waters high but not as dangerous as the rapids Violet had faced upstream. As they approached the ford, Archer suddenly reined in his horse. "Wait," he said, his voice tense. "Something's not right." Violet pulled up beside him, scanning the riverbank. At first she saw nothing amiss. Then a movement caught her eye, a figure emerging from the shadows of the cottonwoods that lined the shore, going somewhere. Jebediah Blackwell stepped into the moonlight, a rifle cradled in his arms. Behind him, more men appeared, surrounding the ford. "I thought you might try for the mountains, Xavier. You're becoming predictable." Archer's hand moved toward his revolver, but Blackwell shook his head. "I wouldn't," he warned. "My men have you covered from all sides." Violet looked around desperately, confirming Blackwell's words. At least 6 men had them in their sights, rifles gleaming in the moonlight. "It's over, Blackwell," Archer said, his voice steady despite their dire situation. "The governor's announced his investigation. Killing us won't change that." "Perhaps not," Blackwell conceded. "But it will be deeply satisfying nonetheless. You've been a thorn in my side for too long, Xavier. And as for Miss Gallagher—" His cold gaze shifted to Violet. "Your father should have taken my offer. It would have spared you this end." "What end would that be?" A new voice called from the darkness behind them. "The one where you hang for murder, Blackwell." They all turned to see Sheriff Davis approaching on horseback, a dozen armed men with him. Among them were Judge Hollister and Frederick Wheaton. "You're outnumbered, Blackwell," the sheriff continued, his rifle trained on the mining magnate, "and witnessed in the act this time. Drop your weapons, all of you." For a tense moment, it seemed Blackwell might resist. Then, with a cold smile, he lowered his rifle. "A temporary setback, Sheriff. Nothing more." "We'll let a jury decide that," the sheriff replied, dismounting and approaching with manacles ready. "Jebediah Blackwell, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Violet Gallagher and Archer Xavier, the attack on Judge Hollister's home, and on suspicion of the murder of Thomas Gallagher." As the sheriff's men disarmed and secured Blackwell and his henchmen, Judge Hollister rode forward to where Violet and Archer waited. "Catherine?" Archer asked immediately, concern evident in his voice. "She's safe," the judge assured him. "Shaken but unharmed." When the attack began, she and the housekeeper hid in the root cellar. One of the servants got out and raised the alarm. Relief washed over Archer's face. "And the men who broke in, 2 dead, 3 captured," the judge replied grimly. "They'll face justice alongside their employer." Violet watched as Blackwell was led away in chains, his arrogant bearing diminished but not broken. "Will it hold?" she asked quietly. "The charges against him. They'll hold," Wheaton answered, joining them. "The governor has already telegraphed Denver. The marshals are on their way, along with a circuit judge known for his incorruptibility. Blackwell's reign is over." The return to town was almost anticlimactic after the night's events. The judge's home, though damaged in the attack, was still habitable. Catherine embraced her brother tearfully upon their return, then extended the same warm welcome to Violet. "I knew you'd be all right," she said, though her red-rimmed eyes suggested she had feared otherwise. "Archer never fails when someone he cares for is in danger." They gathered in the judge's study, a little battered but victorious, to share brandy and recount the night's events. The governor had been informed of Blackwell's arrest and had promised his full support for the prosecution. "It will take time," Judge Hollister cautioned. Men like Blackwell don't go down without a fight, but his power is broken. His allies will abandon him now that he's facing murder charges. As dawn approached, the group finally dispersed to seek what rest they could. Violet found herself too wired to sleep immediately, despite her exhaustion. She stood at the window of her room, watching as the first light of day touched the mountains to the west. A soft knock at her door roused her from her contemplation. She opened it to find Archer, looking as weary as she felt, but with a light in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "It's really over," she said as he entered, closing the door behind him. "It is," he agreed, taking her hands in his. "Blackwell will face justice for your father, for the men on my survey team, for all the others he's harmed over the years. And we can begin to think about the future," Violet said, a smile touching her lips despite her exhaustion. "That's why I'm here," Archer said, his expression growing serious. "Before all this happened, before Blackwell's men attacked, we were talking about possibilities." Violet nodded, her heart quickening at the memory. "A partnership," she said softly. "More than that," Archer replied, his voice low and fervent. "I know it's too soon. We've only known each other a week, but in that time I've come to care for you more than I thought possible." "I feel the same," Violet admitted, stepping closer to him. "When I jumped into that river, I thought I was running toward my death. Instead, I was running toward you, toward a future I couldn't have imagined." Archer raised a hand to her cheek, his touch gentle. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "After everything you've been through, you deserve time to grieve, to heal, to decide what you truly want." "I've had time enough for grief," Violet replied, covering his hand with her own. "And what I want is standing right here." The kiss they shared was tender, a promise of all that might come. When they finally parted, Archer rested his forehead against hers. "Your father's claim," he said. "We could work it together, build something that would honor his memory." "I'd like that," Violet smiled. "Though I think I'd like a house that's not quite so isolated as your cabin." A chuckle rumbled in Archer's chest. "I think that can be arranged," he agreed. "Perhaps something halfway between the wilderness and civilization." "With books," Violet added, remembering his surprisingly literary shelf. "Definitely with books," he nodded. "And maybe, someday, with children." The image caught Violet by surprise, not unpleasantly so, but as a reminder of how far her thoughts had already traveled beyond mere survival. A home, a family, a future with this man who had risked everything to help her find justice. "One step at a time," she said, though the idea warmed her heart. "First the claim, then the house." "And then?" Archer asked, his eyes searching hers. "And then we'll see where the current takes us," Violet replied with a smile. "But I think it's leading somewhere good." "I'm certain of it," Archer said, and sealed the promise with another kiss. Epilogue. 2 years later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the valley as Violet stood on the porch of their home, watching the riders approaching. From this elevation, she could see for miles the town of Wilson below, the winding ribbon of the Gunnison River, and beyond, the snow-capped peaks of the San Juan Mountains. The house stood halfway up the slope from town, a sturdy 2-story structure of pine and local stone that combined the best of Archer's wilderness cabin with the comforts Violet had known in her father's home. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides, offering views in every direction. Inside were the books they both loved, furniture crafted by Archer's hands, and the warmth of a home well lived in. Below the house, closer to town, stood the buildings of the Gallagher mine, expanded now under their joint management, employing 24 men who had the rare fortune of working for fair-minded owners. As the riders drew nearer, Violet recognized Catherine and her husband Daniel, a fellow teacher she had married the previous spring. They visited regularly from Denver, especially now, with the baby due in less than a month. Violet rested a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the child within stir at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The timing was perfect. Catherine had promised to stay until after the birth, something Violet was increasingly grateful for as her time grew near. The door opened behind her, and Archer stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a cloth. He had been working in his woodshop, crafting a cradle for their expected child. "They're here," Violet said, leaning back against him as his arms encircled her from behind, hands resting protectively over hers on her belly. "Right on time," he nodded, kissing the top of her head. "Daniel said they'd be here before sundown." They watched together as the riders made their way up the winding path from town. It had been a good year. The mine was producing well. Their investment in a small lumber mill was showing promise, and the Blackwell trial had finally concluded with convictions on all counts. "Hard to believe it's been 2 years, Violet mused. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I was running for my life. Other times it seems like another lifetime entirely." "It was another lifetime," Archer replied, "for both of us." His hand moved gently over the swell of their child. "This is the one that matters now." Violet turned in his arms, reaching up to touch the scar at his temple that had faded somewhat with time. "No regrets about leaving your mountain refuge," a smile touched Archer's lips. "None," he assured her, "though I do miss the quiet sometimes." "Well, it's about to get a lot less quiet around here," Violet laughed, patting her belly. "Catherine says this one's going to be a boy with lungs to match his father's." "Catherine always did think she knew everything," Archer teased, though his eyes shone with anticipation. "Boy or girl, as long as the baby has your courage, we'll be fine." "And your kindness," Violet added softly. The riders were close now, Catherine waving as they approached the last stretch of path. Violet and Archer moved to the steps to greet them, hand in hand. As they welcomed their family, Violet couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. From the desperate plunge into the rapids that had nearly claimed her life to this moment of peace and promise, it had been a path of both struggle and unexpected joy. "She's caught in the rapids," they had warned, those men who had pursued her that fateful day. And Archer, though she hadn't known him then, had made his choice. "Then I'll ride the current down." And so he had, following her into danger, into a future neither of them could have foreseen. The current had carried them here to justice, to love, to the family they were building together. The rapids were behind them now. Ahead lay calmer waters, and a journey they would navigate side by side.